In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how we think and act when we are in a group.
Maintain the optimistic idea that human beings were, basically good and that they were corrupted by institutions. It's a common idea I think it's a very common idea in universities, because university people are always complaining about the corrupt nature of this institution and that institution. While they sit here in the warmth with the electricity on, it's surrounded by wealth that characterizes maybe 1/10% of the entire world's population, and they complain about how oppressed they are and how nasty the institutions are. It's like, yeah, well, you actually haven't been to a nasty institution, because nasty institutions, they get pretty damn bad, and most of the institutions in the world are like that. So it isn't exactly clear that people are pristine in their heart and then corrupted by institutions, although I'm sure that happens. It happened to Panzram, for example. So anyways, this has been a line of philosophical speculation that's I would say constituted one of the unspoken fundamental assumptions of Western intellectuals in particular. And Jane Goodall thought, in many ways the same way. She thought chimps were basically, they're just animals. They're okay. They coexist relatively peacefully with one another. Even Carl Rogers, who I talk about a bit in my personality class, he basically thought that people were fundamentally good and that institutions made them bad. But the problem is, you look at chimps and they're a fair bit like us. Bonobos, you can look at them too, and they're genetically quite related to us, and they're quite a bit different than chimps. But so we're sort of a weird mixture of the two in some sense. But chimps, like those things, there is no evidence that they really have any internal control over their aggression at all. There was a horrible case about 2 years ago where a woman was interacting with a chimp and it tore her to pieces, and they can do that, man. Like, it took her face right off, and they have the strength of about 6 men. Like an adult male chimp can break a 300-pound test cable. Those things are really, really strong, and they're not friendly. So in Arnhem Zoo, for example, there has been a troop of chimps there that have been followed by an extremely brilliant primatologist named Frans de Waal, whose work I would very highly recommend. De Waal is a very smart guy, and he's looked at the origins of morality in chimpanzees, from a biological perspective. It's very, very nice work, very, very clear-headed. But, he's recounted absolutely horrific stories of chimpanzee behavior. So one of the stories he talked about, for example, was, you kind of have this idea that there's a male chimp hierarchy. It's roughly true. There's a female hierarchy too, but the males in the chimp world anyways tend to be the dominant ones. And, you kind of think of a dominant primate like a prize fighter, pretty much he's ruling because of his physical prowess. Now that turns out not to exactly be true. But in this particular case, the guy who was running the chimp troop was a bit of a bully, and he wasn't very good at making friends. And that's not such a good idea, because no matter how tough you are by yourself, 2 weaker guys can probably take you out, and that's what happened during Frans de Waal's observations. And 2 chimps attacked the leader, and they had a coalition. They were grooming each other. They were pals, and chimps are pretty good at remembering like reciprocal relationships and having friendships, really. Like, they have a very highly social structure. They just tore him apart. Like, the things they did to him, like, you don't even want to talk about. And so chimps have really no upper limit on their capacity for aggression. And when they hunt, because chimps hunt and they like meat, they often hunt colobus monkeys, and they weigh about 35 pounds. Like, a colobus monkey is a major league animal, and they eat those things alive. And they scream while they're being killed, and that does not slow the chimps down one bit. So it's not obvious that the chimp is really a creature of a lot of empathy, especially the males. The females are likely more empathic because they have to deal with infants for longer periods of time. What seems to inhibit the aggression of male chimps isn't anything they hold internally. It seems that when they get hyper-aggressive in the troop gets more and more agitated and basically shuts them down. So you can imagine maybe you're in a rough bar and some dingbat who's, half psychopathic and has had 2 pints of alcohol is starting to cause a tremendous amount of trouble. And he's not going to shut himself down, but the rest of the troop might. And that kind of means that the control over the aggression is externalized. It's not a consequence of superego control. And we like to think that we actually control our own aggression, but I'm not so sure about that. If you read things like, there's a great book, a horrifying book, published about 20 years ago called The Rape of Nanking, which is Well, the woman who wrote it committed suicide, so that sort of suffices to tell you what the Rape of Nanking is about. And it's a story about the Japanese in World War II going into a Chinese city called Nanking, where I believe about 350,000 people were killed. And the Nazis in that story were the good guys, so you can imagine the kind of brutality that might be occurring there. But there's absolutely perfectly well documented evidence suggesting that the Japanese soldiers engaged in competitive brutality. And so really what happened was the Japanese had been pretty militarized by World War II, and they'd adopted a Prussian education system, and the Prussians, Germans, pre-20th century Germans, they were basically interested in educating obedient soldiers, because it was a militaristic culture. And the Japanese kind of adopted that because they were sick of being kicked around by the Europeans. And pretty successfully, because they defeated the Russians, in the early stages of World War of the 20th century. It was quite a shock to everyone in Europe, and cause for great celebration in Japan, and no wonder. But anyways, they militarized the hell out of their young men and taught them basically that the Japanese were a master race, and that other people were subhuman. It's a very common human way of thinking, by the way. I would say it's really the default way that human tribes think about other tribes. It's a little more complicated than that because human tribes tend to trade with other tribes. So it's not all demonization, but a lot of it is, and if you look around the world in the anthropological literature, what you see is that the names that most tribes have for themselves is something like the human beings or the people. Indicating that the rest of the people aren't really people. God only, they're barbarians, or, they live out where the sun is being eaten by the dragon of the night or something like that. And, the word barbarian is a word that comes from the Greeks making fun of how non-Greeks spoke. They thought they went bar, 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 something like that. So, anyways, what Goodall found was that the chimps, like the chimp adolescents in particular the males, would patrol the borders of their territory in groups of 3 or 4, and often with a female or two. But the females didn't seem to be really they were more part of the group rather than the initiators. But what the chimps would do is if they found a chimp from another troop, even if that was a chimp that had moved from their troop in the not too distant past and joined another, because sometimes the males leave and sometimes they go to other troops, if they outnumbered them, they would tear them to pieces. And it looked like that's why they were doing the border patrol. They're out looking for trouble. They're gangs, roughly speaking. They're looking for trouble. But the point of it is that, and they would only attack if they outnumbered. Because chimps can, I wouldn't say they count, but they have a rudimentary notion of group size, I don't think you can count without being able to verbalize, but you can estimate at a glance. And so, when I say tear apart, that's exactly what I mean. There's no upper limit on the brutality. And so Goodall discovered that first. And she didn't tell anybody about it. Now, she had her reasons. Some of them I think were ideological. Oh, the lovely chimps, and fair enough. But some of it was also, she thought that maybe the chimps had been corrupted as a consequence of their contact with human beings and that their natural behavior had been somehow transformed. And that's not, it's reasonable to be cautious if you're a scientist before you go out and say, hey, chimps go to war. Isn't that revolutionary? Because it is, right? Because it just ends the idea that our warlike and malevolent nature is a function of culture. Like if chimps do it, well, what are they, perverted by their own culture? I don't think so. There are more and less violent chimp cultures and there are more and less violent baboon cultures. So there's some cultural variation. But since Goodall's time, this sort of behavior is being documented on many, many chimp troops. So that's us in a nutshell. And it's not self-evident that if you put the typical adolescent male, say, who's not a very well-formulated personality, and because he's not that individual, and he hasn't seen much of the world, and the typical guy that goes into the army is, he's kind of on the margins of society, maybe he's not particularly bright, and I'm not trying to be insulting by that, but it's not exactly a high-end job. You put someone like that in a place where there's no rules. It's like, who leads where there are no rules? Well, the probability that it's the friendliest and nicest people is very, very low. And so what seemed to happen in Nanking was the Japanese soldiers took their cues from the people with the most brutal imaginations. So, and people can have pretty brutal imaginations, especially when they start to compete. So